Of the many broken Pokemon over the years, many of them have been banned to Ubers where they belong. But as diligent as the player base can be on these matters, certain Pokemon slip through the cracks for one reason or another. Today we have several Pokemon that, for their overwhelming negative impact on their respective metagames, there's an argument that they probably should have gotten the axe. Some of these you'll definitely see coming, and others not so much. And as a disclaimer, we are not calling for these Pokemon to be banned. We are simply highlighting that many of them should have been, as that is what's being expressed by the player bases of the respective metagames themselves. So let's jump in with a seriously contentious pair from the 5th generation, Black and White's Drizzle and Latios. You could pick a number of Pokemon that should have been banned from Gen 5, whose turbulent, controversy-filled history was in large part defined by its refusal to address its many problems. It at times seems to be a metagame almost entirely comprised of things that should have been banned. We've selected the two that stand above all the others, the original sin and the later more insidious development. It begins, of course, with Drizzle, whose peerless brokenness dominated early Black and White. There was nothing like Swift Swim Kingdra's Choice Specs Hydro Pumps under permanent rain, deleting everything in sight, except the few water immunities that were terrified of its Draco Meteor. But without an immunity, you were toast, and even the mighty Ferrothorn couldn't save you. 3-hit KO'd as it was, especially since Kingdra's fellow Swift Swimmer Kabutops was waiting in the back, and potentially many others. This was the most immediately apparent broken aspect of Drizzle, as the other nightmares like 100% accuracy Thunder and Hurricane and Scald becoming as powerful as Hydro Pump, and the enabling of Ferrothorn and Rain Dish Tentacruel, all of them seemed tame compared to Swift Swim, though they also enhanced it a great deal and were essential in launching Rain to its place to destroy and define every part of the metagame. The cries to simply ban Drizzle and be done with it were as many as there were reasonable. However, this was the first time permanent Rain had been available in OU, and some were eager to maintain it, leading to the complex ban of Drizzle and Swift Swim on the same team. Rain had lost its most broken aspect, yes, but it was still massively broken. If you didn't run Weather, you were at a major disadvantage. Sand and Sun became as important as they were because they could actually challenge the Rain. However, the simple fact was that several Pokemon became absolutely broken under Rain, a number which only grew when Black and White 2 came around, with many brutal new Pokemon like Tornadus Therian. And yet, because of a desire to see Gen 5 be the weather generation no matter what, all the clamoring for Rain's brokenness to be addressed at the source was to no effect. Time passed and the complaints against Rain were still many, but at that point the desire to not ban Weather had wound up entrenching it so firmly into the generation's fabric that a metagame without it was inconceivable. To ban Drizzle would have completely overhauled the tier, which would have been fine during the current generation, but now as a past generation, it was too late. It was a similar tale for Latios, whose usage during the current generation was strangely low, constantly competing with Latias, whose greater bulk provided defensive utility, more generally seen as useful against the massively power-crept metagame. But as it turns out, the game's strongest Draco Meteor was the ultimate counter to pretty much everything. During the post-generational metagame shifts, Latios rose to become the tier's single most threatening Pokemon. If you didn't have Pursuit, and let's be real, this meant Tyranitar, unless you wanted your Scizor to get deleted by Specs, Surf, and Rain. If you didn't have Pursuit, it didn't matter that you had Bulky Steels or even Ferrothorn. Latios would simply switch in and out, as it did so effortlessly with its great typing, speed, and natural bulk, effortlessly Draco bombing you over and over until eventually you succumbed. If it didn't more immediately ruin your Jirachi or Ferrothorn with Trick, or Hidden Power Fire that is. Even having Pursuit didn't necessarily mean you were safe. Latios turned this to its team's advantage, as once your Tyranitar took its hit, it would no longer be able to take on Latios' teammate Alakazam. However, even once Latios' brokenness became known and accepted, banning it was never on the table, and it'd be too drastic a change for the now old generation. For the same logic applied to Rain. If it were banned, the metagame would be so different as to alienate the player base that has since accepted the metagame's flaws, even thinking of them as features instead. Plus, as a past gen, there was a doubt as to the number of players to meaningfully test such a significant unknown domino effect. This is the same reasoning against banning the original broken Pokemon that were kept for tradition, like Gen 1 Tauros and Gen 2 Snorlax. After banning X, we'd have to ban Y shouldn't usually be a factor if you're trying to make the game more competitive. Good time for a reminder that just because the game can't be perfect doesn't mean it can't be improved. This was unfortunately too idealistic for those more worried about the practical side of things. Now for another double whammy, but a different kind, with Gen 5 and Gen 6 Volcarona. This cross-generational king of controversy, kicking up commotion ever since it first quiver danced in Gen 5, was finally banned in Gen 9, but many a top player would tell you that that should not have been the first time it got axed from OU. To many, Volcarona embodies much of what is wrong with the game. If it hits, it hits. Many Pokemon in their good matchups tend to claim things like unstoppable KOs each time they hit the field. Volcarona claims entire games. After a single boost, it sweeps entire teams from full health. This is generally considered to be too high of a reward. Other Pokemon, when their matchups aren't as good, tend tend to still have something they can contribute, however small. Volcarona tends to fall flat on its face and do nothing, aided in no small part by its horrendous quadruple stealth rock weakness, matchup moth as they call it. This is exacerbated by how restrictive it is to address in the team builder. It's so powerful after a quiver dance that dancing around it is very rarely an option, but it's not exactly easy to counter it head on either, as much of what can take hits from it is dependent on the moveset it's running at the time. It might run into a matchup where half the opposing team stifles its given build, or it might have Lumberry to set up against Ferrothorn's Thunderwave, then Hidden Power ground the Heatran and Giga Drain the Keldeo. Oh, and if that's not enough, it can also just straight up melt its checks with the immense power of a boosting item. It contributed to the gems getting banned in Gen 5, and it was a terror with Z moves in Gen 7, but the cross-generational option is Life Orb, most prominent in the generations we've selected here, 5 and 6, which are also the generations where Volcarona has most directly received support and attempts to have it banned. Of course, the Volcarona experience also extends to its hidden power lacking Gen 8, where it also was able to nullify even Stealth Rock thanks to heavy duty boots, and it was in 5 and 6 where its presence was most overwhelming, especially 5. Yes, one could always cite the easy answer of Stealth Rock as a reason not to ban it, but this tended to spectacularly miss the point. The strain Volcarona exerted was immense, because it was a speed boosting Pokemon that very few Choice Scarfers could outspeed, and a power boosting Pokemon that very few walls could withstand. Checking it was so specific and set dependent, even a team that combined answers to one set might just get blown away by another. This wasn't a case of bad teams, it was simply absurd to expect teams lacking Chansey to be able to handle it reliably. Even Gen 5 Rain teams were regularly crushed by many Volcarona sets. What more could one be expected to throw at it? Whether or not a team could answer Volcarona was to ignore the effect the Pokemon had on its metagame or metagames, which was that in any given matchup, it offered players a potential nigh automatic win, which was generally seen as a negative, even by those who didn't want to ban it, which were the majority. And speaking of Stealth Rock, you can't mention things that should have been banned without mentioning Stealth Rock, the ultimate cross-generational ban evader that has played a role in the ban of nearly every broken Pokemon since its 4th generation debut. It's basically gotten enough assists in this department to give it its own category. Yes, it keeps many rock-weak Pokemon in check, but in addition to Volcarona, there are other rock-weak terrors like Gen 4 Salamence and Gen 5 Tornado Styrian, whose weakness to Stealth Rock was outweighed by how much more difficult they were to counter because of it. These Pokemon were monstrous even without having varying degrees of damage digging into every answer launched their way. Many would-be checks were nullified as answers because of their rock weakness or even just neutrality, but even Stealth Rock resistant Pokemon didn't care for the extra damage when every percentage was key to withstanding such huge hits. Of course, these aren't just the rock-weak Pokemon still finding brokenness. If they could do it, it was especially terrifying for everything else. Most troublesome were the threats with the opposite relation to rocks. They resisted it, and their checks were weak to it, mostly clearly illustrated by fighting types, barely scratched by rocks, while the flying types that would check them struggled to switch in comfortably. Regardless of the specifics of Rock's weaknesses, so much of checking a Pokemon revolved around who could set up and maintain Stealth Rock. Something like Dragonite's multi-skill remained intact or not could make all the difference. This led to many issues of team matchup where Stealth Rock and anti-Stealth Rock strategies clashed to see which side would be better off to utilize this hazard with such enormous effect that it swung entire games. On the few occasions a Stealth Rock-less metagame was tested, however informally, the result was not a chaotic eruption of focus sashes everywhere, but a metagame that took many of the best aspects of Gen 3, i.e. that it was much easier to check pretty much everything, not just because defensive options like Moltres opened up, but because there was less pressure on everything that had to take hits, leading to a more reasonable pace of play despite the high power level overall. Some Pokemon would be broken without Stealth Rock, sure, but those Pokemon tend to find a way regardless. See what Volcarona and Dragonite tend to do, often on the same team, when facilitated by teammates designed and dedicated to keep Stealth Rock off at all costs. It may generally keep these Pokemon in check, but Stealth Rock does so at the cost of exacerbating the power of everything else, and it should have been tried at least once. It was discussed many times, but instantly shot down even at the beginning of generations that had yet to establish and define themselves. To even think about playing without rocks was unacceptable. Now going back to a metagame without Stealth Rock, we have Gen 3 Dugtrio. This is a big one. Arena Trap has been banned from every generation it's existed in, except Gen 3 where it was introduced. It took a while for the other gens to catch onto Arena Trap's brokenness, which is nowadays taken as self-evident, but even after it was getting banned from gen after gen, Gen. Despite the inevitable questions of what about Gen 3, nothing ever came of it, because these seem to be no such problem. Gen 3 seemed to be the exception, well, until relatively recently. It's not that Dugtrio was thought of as bad, it's always been top tier, but for the most part of Gen 3's existence, it was also just a part of the metagame. It kept other top tier threats in check. Without Dugtrio, imagine just how difficult it'd be to handle Tyranitar, or Blissey, or Jirachi, Metagross, Celebi, Heracross, Raikou. Ridiculous, right? Of course, not every team had Dugtrio, not even close, and while it wasn't necessary to handle such threats, those Pokemon became markedly more terrifying without Dugtrio on the opposing team. Even if it doesn't actually wind up trapping them, its presence alone alters how they can be used. If you get a KO with Tyranitar, for instance, you better make it count, because Dugtrio is going to come in after, and make sure you don't get any more. And that's if the Dugtrio user doesn't manage to somehow work around Dugtrio's immense frailty to pick you off before you get to KO anything at all. Its lack of hit taking seems to be on par with Deoxys' attack, but it's deceptively capable in this regard. For instance, it can survive things like Jirachi's super effective hit and power grass, and that's without any bulk investment. Plenty of Dugtrio bulk themselves out to survive stronger hits like Blissey's Ice Beam. And yet, building a team that's good into Dugtrio is just part of making a good team. Or it was, at least. You could have teams like the Superman style, which, in their quest to stack flyers and levitators to ignore spikes, are naturally, effortlessly Dugtrio proof. Of course, these teams go out of their way to not be grounded, the opposite of the default for most teams, but even non-Superman styles found Dugtrio pretty manageable. You can punish that Dugtrio revenge kill in so many ways. To name but a few, there's Skarmory's Spike Shuffling, Aerodactyl's mighty attacks, and Salamence's game-ending Dragon Dance. Even a team full of Dugtrio weaks can maneuver around Dugtrio since its choice band means it can only lock into one move at a time. It aerial aces your Heracross, and suddenly Tyranitar is Dragon Dancing in front of it. Or it Earthquakes your Tyranitar, and suddenly your Heracross is substituting down to its Salackberry before picking up a Swords Dance and sweeping everything. Alternatively, such teams can outright remove Dugtrio by trapping it back, whether with Porygon 2, whose trace ability let it use Dugtrio's Arena Trap against it, or with their own Dugtrio, not by relying on winning a speed tie, but by taking advantage of the opposing Dugtrio locking into a weather move which it could survive, either Hidden Power Bug to take out Celebi, or Aerial Ace to take out Heracross or Breloom. Additionally, Dugtrio had the problem of not actually being that strong, even with Choice Band. It wasn't like in Gen 7, where its base attack had been buffed to 100. It had base 80, and it would struggle to KO bulky variants of Tyranitar, Metagross, Jirachi, and even the Celebi it was hitting for quadruple effective damage with Hidden Power Bug. So, what's the problem? Well, even with base 80 attack, Dugtrio was effortlessly picking a lot of Pokemon off, needing just a bit of chip damage against the bulkier ones, and often not needing anything against more offensive ones. But the real problem came with the optimization of Dugtrio on defensive teams, as it had in all those other generations. This wasn't a new idea, as Gen 3's bulky teams had long since loved Dugtrio to limit the wall breakers that would otherwise threaten them, and it was always a particular effective, oppressive playstyle. But it really came to a head in recent years, inspired by Arena Trap's brokenness in the other gens, to create defensive teams that were nigh unbreakable with Dugtrio in the wings. It perfectly supported Skarmory, Claydol, Milotic, and Blissey, picking off the few Pokemon capable of breaking through them. And remember, this is only 4 Pokemon, meaning after Dugtrio, there's still a 6th team member to be added to round the defense out further. The 6th Pokemon was almost a flavor pick though. It almost didn't even matter. Seriously, this set of 5 was so defining, it was capable of winning many games without even needing to have a 6th Pokemon at all. It wasn't just the style either, as more forms of optimized Dugtrio defense came to push the issue to the forefront as it had in other generations. When it came to the classic clash of offense versus defense, traditionally, defense had an advantage, but now Dugtrio was stacking the deck too heavily in their favor. The problem was that the use of offensive teams became increasingly discouraged because they had to fight a ridiculously uphill battle against this incredibly common style, as most of the best wall breakers against such teams were incredibly Dugtrio weak. Dugtrio proofing the Pokemon made them worse wall breakers. Bulky Tyranitar can survive an Earthquake from full health, true, but bulky Tyranitar is also far less threatening to the defensive core behind Dugtrio, and with a bit of spikes damage, it'll eventually get trapped anyway. On the other hand, there's very little a well-played choice band can't break over time, but not so much with Dugtrio. The same goes for Swords Dance Heracross, which would otherwise be even more of a terror, and yet it is severely limited. It's not just Pokemon weak to moves either. This is limited territory, as most grounded Pokemon are alarmingly vulnerable to Dugtrio, but even fully neutral Pokemon like Snorlax, Swampert, and Suicune tend to get picked off by Dugtrio once they take in a few few hits. They needed to be in pristine condition to stay out of range, meaning damaging the opposing core and not becoming vulnerable to Dugtrio, that just wasn't realistic. There was only so much you could play around Dugtrio in both team builder and battle, given how few the options were against such a potent defensive core, which was exactly the problem as had been in the other generations. It often took just one successful trap, even after KO, for the team to become unbreakable. Remember that off unneeded 6 Pokemon? Well, there was its use. Even if you trapped Dugtrio back with Porygon 2 or your own Dugtrio, the damage would be done, and too often it couldn't be overcome. So with Arena Trap turning out to be just as much of a limiting factor as in the other several top players begin to voice their issues with it, questioning of it was healthy. But despite talks of trying a Dugtrio-less metagame in a test tournament, nothing ever came of it. Of course, there were concerns of just how different, inconceivably so, the concept of a Dugtrio-less metagame would be from what Gen 3 had always been, which is a major adjustment for a metagame older than many of the people now playing it. And of course, special offense teams were massively reliant on Dugtrio to remove Blissey. Then again, Dugtrio was also a major threat to these special offense teams. Regardless of the result, the can was kicked down the road for years, yet the complaints remain. But also the will to see something done about it has weakened. But unlike Dugtrio, which is as strong as ever, now on to our grand finale with Gen 4 Jirachi and its Iron Head. What else could possibly go here? You thought Gyarados and its infamously unfortunate 20% waterfall flinches were a problem? Well, actually, they were, but they were nothing compared to the even more notorious Jirachi and its Iron Head, whose flinch rate was triple Gyarados' waterfall. 60% flinch is going to be a problem on pretty much anything you put it on. Well, maybe not Dunsparce. Well, even Togekiss has some notoriety with its nasty air slashes, a concept Shaman Sky took so far it got banned to Ubers. There are many who believe Jirachi followed them there, and one can't exactly say they're wrong. Jirachi is the most iconic Pokemon to be so universally despised and yet never have been banned. It's packing 60% flinch, yes, but it's also an all-around outstanding Pokemon to begin with, even without Iron Head in its arsenal. That's why being able to so freely flinch its way through just about everything is so devastating. Not only does it transcend the fact that it's not actually that powerful, but it's also not entirely reliant on the move to do anything. Everyone likes to claim they've seen it flinch out full health leftovers Magnezone, Heatran, or Empoleon, despite their quadruple steel resist, and that only really happens if it's also chaining together a lot of critical hits, which is a separate thing. What's far more likely is exactly why it's so scary. It doesn't need to flinch out these three, as it's much likelier to just beat them outright with something like Hidden Power Ground, the same way it's likelier to beat Skarmory with Thunderbolt than it is to flinch it out from full. Of course, Jirachi does regularly flinch out several of these checks, even if it might come close to running out of Iron Head PP by the end, especially against something like Zapdos or Suicune with their pressure. The fact that it has 24 Iron Heads is an issue, but it's the fact that it does this on top of being so scary to begin with, and that's what makes it such a problem. It contrasts severely in this regard with Togekiss, which is Stealth Rock weak, affected by Sandstorm, much slower, and far less threatening outside of Air Slash flinches. Even if Jirachi doesn't get one flinch, who cares? It's not like it's easy to take out and return. It regularly eats super effective stab earthquakes. It also regularly uses Iron Head as a recovery move, racking up leftovers with each flinch, which really makes it tough to take out. It might be in KO range of an attack, but then a mere few flinches later, well, never mind. That's just Iron Head too. This is to say nothing of the frustration of Jirachi's 60% body slam paralysis, which it prefers over the guarantee of Thunder Wave since it can't be stopped by taunt or, more importantly, a ground type. Even a slow ground type like Swampert or Hippowdon doesn't appreciate being paralyzed, as it's an extra percentage chance, a good one, for them not to move, thus making it that much more feasible for Jirachi to flinch them out from a certain range. As if this weren't bad enough, Jirachi's 20% Fire Punch burn is less likely, but far more ruinous. Any bulky Pokemon not named Heatran that's supposed to take its Iron Head hits is utterly ruined by an errant, not all that unlikely Fire Punch burn in conjunction with Iron Head thwarting any attempt at healing it off. Of course, Heatran doesn't like being paralyzed. Tactics like Lumberry don't exactly work either, as without leftovers, Jirachi will probably just outlast you, and it's way likelier to be able to safely status you again before you're able to safely take it out. On one hand, making a team that's good into Jirachi is part of the metagame. It demands Steel's resist with longevity, and it demands they are played well, much like Gen 3 Tyranitar and Aerodactyl's Rock Slide flinches that mandate resilient rock resist. If your Steel's resists are frail and lack longevity to the point where it just takes a couple of flinches to ruin you, your team isn't good, as you're also probably going to get cleaned up by things like a Swords Dance or Choice Band Bullet Punch Scizor, an Agility Meteor Mash Metagross, or a Trick Room Gyro Ball Bronzong. This This kind of metagame restriction is fine, even healthy. On the other hand, not only does Jirachi restrict the metagame far too much with what is able to switch into its RNG antics, see the fire punch burn problem, but it also degenerates in-game play to absurd degrees. It encourages what is to many the worst aspects of Pokemon, simply spamming percentages, fishing for percentages, which are overwhelming in its favor almost no matter what it's facing, and it encourages such tactics because it so often rewards them. It turns the game into what is something referred to as odds maxing, where you don't have to worry about positions when you simply have the tools to reliably RNG your way through everything. If it's so consistent, why wouldn't you? So yes, for over a decade and a half, the player base has railed against Jirachi, and it's only become more optimized over time, having contributed to many a negative metagame shift and overall perception of the tier. So why no ban? Well, for a long time, the player base feared what the metagame would be like without Jirachi, when the tier was in constant fear of overpowering offensive teams. Jirachi was a unifying force that kept them in check more consistently than anything else at the time. This was reaffirmed once Latias returned to the tier, with Jirachi being one of the best answers to it. But times have changed. Metagame developments led to offense being far more manageable now, even without Jirachi's help. This includes Latias, whose most defining sets, the bulky Thunderwave spammers, most Jirachi sets are not ideal answers to, as they hate Thunderwave, resulting in Latias being checked by many other metagame staples. Of course, a Jirachi ban would be a major change, as it does naturally match up against so much in the metagame, but it's no longer needed to keep the tier together, not even against Latias, and thus it's not likely a wave of bans would need to follow in its wake. Still, while many players loathe what Jirachi does, it's so familiar to their conception of the metagame that the idea of banning it is a step too far. Many opportunities to discuss the Jirachi ban have come up over the years, yet each and every time, the player base themselves don't want to get rid of it. For them, is it a problem? Yes. Do they want to ban it? No. Does this lead to a lot of arguably hypocritical complaints over games where Jirachi does things? Also yes. The idea of just banning Ironhead was floated, which everyone liked. Jirachi gets to say, minus the thing that makes it broken, and nothing else uses the move. And even if they did, it'd be worth sacrificing them for it, like how Sleep Powder Rose Raid was sacrificed to take down the greater evil of Spore Breloom. Sadly, in the same way Spore was not allowed to be banned over all sleep moves, and Dynamic Punch was not allowed to be banned over Machamp as a whole, Ironhead wasn't allowed to be banned, only Jirachi. So despite its brokenness, the fear of a Jirachi-less metagame has prevented its ban. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Don Creek, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Howl, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Gameslayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Seagulls Incorporated, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Gylaria, Soras and Croxon, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Tyler, Kiboflu, Wardine, Zathor for their major support of our videos.